My name is Emma Catherine Rivera. I am 34 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, in a small apartment above a bakery whose morning smells, yeast and butter and warm sugar, have been the only reliable comfort in my life for years. I work as a case manager for a non-profit that helps young adults aging out of foster care. On paper, my life looks stable. Modest rent, a few friends I can count on, and a cluttered bookshelf of books I never get to finish. But inside, the quiet is loud. There are mornings when the weight in my chest feels like a thing that can be held. Heavy, stony, and impossible to shift. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Telling this aloud makes my hands shake, but if one person hears themselves in this, then it will be worth it. People say you never forget a sentence that shaped your life. For me it wasn't a lullaby, it was a ledger. We saved you. You owe us. My adoptive father, Mark Whitman, said it like a benediction and a mortgage. He said it the first night we brought me home from the agency when I was 6. Messy hair, 2 big shoes, a sweater with a hole in the elbow. He said it again every time I pushed back. When I refused to clean the garage at 12 after a day of school, when I asked him why he drank out of the same chipped mug every morning though there were fine china cups in a locked cabinet. It became the punctuation mark at the end of every favor, every withheld smile. My adoptive mother, Claire, had hands that smelled faintly of lavender and prayer. She was soft in public and brittle at night, folding herself around Mark's anger like tissue paper. They lived in a split-level house in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, with a lawn that was always too green. I learned how to make their coffee just right. I learned how to laugh at jokes that were not funny. I learned how to keep my head down so the debt would feel paid. When I say we, it always meant them, like a tiny bank's vault with my makeshift savings inside. I became indebted to gestures, tuition, a roof, a cello lesson I never wanted. I learned to equate their charity with ownership. The first time I felt true fear around them was when I was 16. I'd been home late, had my keys jangling in a pocket as clouds pushed rain against the windows. Mark was in the garage, tinkering with an antique lawnmower, a cigarette dangling from his mouth even though he'd sworn he'd quit decades ago. He looked up at me, thin chin gone sharp, and said, "We saved you, Em. Don't make me regret it." The words were casual and precise. They folded me inward. I remember the concrete smell of the garage and the way the rain moved across the oil-stained driveway like veins. My chest tightened until it felt like someone had wrapped a belt around it. That night I lay awake and rehearsed escape routes. I mapped the town by streetlights and bus schedules. I learned which neighbors left songs on their porches late and which morning buses stopped near the high school. I learned how to breathe through panic until panic became a domestic rhythm. When I turned 18, I left for college on a small scholarship, and the first pang of real independence tasted like pennies and instant ramen. Leaving felt like paying a small fee on a gigantic loan. I was off their payroll but still under their moral mortgage. There was a different kind of debt that followed me to university. The internal accounting of a life built upon someone else's mercy. I'd sit in class and listen to other students talk about choices and think of Mark's voice saying, "We saved you." He said it when he told me about the roof being fixed or the car bought for college. He said it when he lent me money for the first rent deposit and then reminded me, a year later, that loans have interest, even invisible ones. My roommate, Hannah, used to iron my shirts and tell me, "You're harder on yourself than anyone else." She didn't understand that the ledger in my head was not a rational accounting. It was a talisman that kept me from anger, from asking for more. To get angry felt like theft. You don't grieve the holder of your debt. You protect them. I learned to be small in crowded places and loud in empty rooms where no one could hear me. Work after college felt like a pilgrimage back to the places I'd left. Shelters, waiting rooms, the clack of fluorescent lights. I gravitated toward people who were counted out, toward the smell of bleach and microwave coffee. Maybe I thought I could undo something with service. Maybe I wanted to repay in advance. I became a good listener and a bad confessor. I swallowed stories that felt like shards and handed out band-aids. I saw Mark maybe twice a year after I moved to Portland. Claire called more often. with small updates that meant nothing and everything. Their calls were weather reports of their own making. "Mark's fine. He's been working on the deck. We should visit in July." The deck was always under construction. Mark's voice over the phone was less sharp than in person, older, the edges softened, but the sentence "we saved you" lived in his pauses. The straw that broke something in me happened over a single, crisp November weekend. I had been hoarding vacation days and finally used them to go back to Ohio. The drive was a long ribbon of interstate, cornfields frothing with frost. The house looked the same from the outside. The lawn was still smug and green. Inside, the house smelled like lemon cleaner and old wood. Claire was at the kitchen table, a stack of bills in front of her and a tissue in hand. Mark's truck was in the driveway, but there was something about the way he had been avoiding the living room that didn't fit his usual swagger. I went to the garage because something, an old habit, a curiosity, drew me there. That's where he kept the things that mattered to him: a box of faded photographs, a carved chess set, a cardboard banker's box full of papers tied with twine. The box had my middle name on the lid, in his hurried block handwriting. I should have left it alone. Instead, I slid a finger under the twine. What I found was not a favor to be repaid. It was a ledger of other people's debts. Tax documents, letters from businesses, receipts for things he never mentioned, donations credited to names I recognized from soup kitchens, mortgage payments for houses he said he had never owned. In the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of tinted envelopes, was a folder labeled Agency, with my original file inside. A birth certificate, a contract, dates that contradicted what I had been told about the timing of my adoption. My stomach went icy. The garage smelled like oil and old paper and the faint metallic tang of panic. I remember the cold spread from my fingertips to my arms. My hands trembled. The gravel under the garage door seemed louder than it was. When I heard the truck door close, I slid the folder back into place and straightened as best I could, acting casual in a way that made me feel like an actor in a low-budget play. Mark didn't look at me when he came in. He kept his eyes on the box, and then on me, as if seeing the scene unfold in his head. "What's that one?" he asked, tapping the box with a blunt finger. "Just some paperwork," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "We saved you, Em," he said, softer than usual. "You don't need to go digging." I wanted to ask him what exactly he had saved me from, to tear open that word until it revealed itself. Instead, I folded the paper back into the box and said nothing. That silence was a contract we kept renewing. I would not ask, he would not change. I told myself I was protecting Claire and the fragile balance of the household. I told myself I was paying a debt. But the ledger in my head had new entries. Suspicion, curiosity, the knowledge that I was part of an arrangement whose terms I had never consented to. That night, I lay awake on the same mattress I had slept on as a teenager and listened to the house settle. The ceiling fan ticked. Somewhere downstairs, the dishwasher hummed through a cycle. I watched the shadows move on the wall like slow tides and felt the word "oh" hollow out a space inside me. I thought about running away again, about telling the agency about the papers, about calling a lawyer. I thought about all of the people Mark might have hurt, and I thought about the cost of leaking a life built on someone else's idea of mercy. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. It's not a neat story. It never was. When you grow up inside the idea that someone saved you, accountability becomes a weapon you learn to deflect. For years after that night in the garage, I carried the folder like contraband, a folded paper that sat in a shoebox under my mattress. I told myself I was waiting. For what, I'm not sure. For courage. For evidence that would make action painless. For the right alignment of stars. The truth was simpler and scarier. I was afraid of being the person who broke our fragile myth. Over the next several months, an unlikely alignment of events toppled my patience. Claire's health began to fail with the quiet cruelty of a winter that eats the leaves. It started with forgetfulness, a missed appointment here, a phone call to the wrong kid there. At first we shrugged it off as exhaustion. Then a fall, a photo broken and a hip fractured, and suddenly their small house had a hospital scent pressed into the fabric of the cushions. Mark's cigarettes doubled. His voice sharpened into something brittle. The man who had once used me as an argument, "We saved you," now used my presence as a prop. "You'll help us through this, right?" he would say, eyes slick with obligation. "You owe us." Claire's rehabilitation was messy. The physical therapist's office smelled of lotion and sweat. She could no longer climb the stairs without tears. At night, she would wake and call out Paul, names blurry, memories tangled. It hurt to watch the softness in her face ripple like water. She had been both a protector and a participant in Mark's control, and now she was aging into vulnerability. I found myself sitting at her bedside, pressing fingers to her pulse, whispering the names of things to ground her. Names of streets, flavors she liked, the color of my childhood blanket. I came to resent the old ledger and the new debt in equal measure. Was my duty to care for the woman who had folded around Mark's rage, or to the child who had been told she owned nothing of herself? Meanwhile, Mark began to show a different face. In public, he was a man of civic virtue. Church committees, PTA meetings, a presence at the shelter's fundraising gala where he would shake hands and smile while Claire limped gracefully beside him. In private, he was someone who expected things. He expected dinners cooked at certain times, apologies for small slights, obedience for favors rendered. The phrase, "you owe us," shifted subtly to "you owe me," and it was meant as payment in full for everything I had been given. There were other ripples. My younger brother, Jonah, who had grown up with me in the house and was bound by the same loans of mercy, began to drink more often. He justified himself with a line I knew too well. "He took us in." He used that sentence to excuse his anger toward the world. We fought, not always about anything big, sometimes about who left the dishes, sometimes about his girlfriend, sometimes about the fact that he had been marked by the same narrative as I had. He would say, "We protect the family," and I would feel the phrase like a collar clamping tighter. One night, in the middle of an argument about money and fairness, Jonah grabbed the shoebox under my bed. "You're hiding things," he accused, his breath reeking of beer and old promises. In the light of my bedside lamp, the folder looked small and dangerous. "What are you doing?" I asked, but the question was half for him and half for myself. "You owe us," he slurred, mimicking Mark. "You think you can just leave and come back like nothing changed?" This was the point where the ledger in my mind tipped into action. I had felt like a ledger that only collected interest. Now it demanded a payment that had nothing to do with money. That night Jonah tore open the folder and read aloud bits of letters, accounts redirected, signatures that weren't mine, dates that told a different origin story. The house seemed to shrink around the lines. Jonah looked at me with something that wavered between betrayal and relief, as if all he'd been carrying made sense when it was shared. "I didn't know," he said finally, small and raw. "You didn't have to," I answered. But the words tasted incomplete. I was tired of being the guardian of illusions. The more I held the folder, the more it felt like a live wire. Dangerous, necessary. I couldn't give it back to the box and lock it away again without suffocating under the knowledge. The first concrete step toward repaying the debt Mark had insisted I owed came from an unlikely source: the non-profit I worked for. We host a confidential clinic every quarter where people can get legal advice free of charge. I mentioned, offhand and trembling, that I had some old adoption papers that looked wrong. An attorney, Mara, whose voice never sounded surprised, told me I could file a motion to access the full agency records. "You might be surprised what's in there," she said. Her words were both a warning and an invitation. That night I sat in my car behind the clinic with my fingers drumming the steering wheel until the sun bled out over the parking lot. For the first time in years, I felt like I had stepped off a very steep cliff and was only halfway to the ground. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. It makes a difference when stories like this find others carrying similar weights. I filed the request. The process was bureaucratic and slow. Forms typed in the blue light of late nights, signatures that made my hand ache. When the packet finally arrived, the paper felt heavier than usual, as though ink itself had weight. The agency's records were meticulous and small-minded at the same time. Dates, names, notarized statements. Buried in them was a different truth than the one I had been told. My adoption had been arranged under circumstances the agency now marked as expedited, a euphemism that meant the usual checks had been bypassed. The woman who signed the initial relinquishment had a name I didn't recognize, and the timeline suggested that someone had pushed me into their hands faster than necessary. There were notes about donor families and funds exchanged. These were not just papers. They were a map of movement, of bodies and obligations, of favors paid in the dark. When I confronted Mark with the records, his face went slack. For a beat I thought I might see regret. He held the envelope like a man holding a defensive weapon. "You don't understand," he said. "We kept you safe. There's nothing wrong with helping." "Helping isn't a ledger," I said. "You turned people into transactions." Mark's jaw flexed. "Everyone has bills," he said. "Everyone does what they must. We did what we had to." There was an exhaustion to his words, as if he had been rehearsing them for years. It was the same tired belief that mercy gave him rights. But I had read the margins. I had seen the names. There was a moral arithmetic I could no longer ignore. That night I sat up with the legal packet in my lap and watched the streetlights cast long rectangles across the kitchen floor. I was sick to my stomach, electrified and tired, because I knew what honesty would cost. It would cost our fragile family story. It would cost Mark his civic chairs and his smile at church bazaars. It would cost Claire peace in her last years. It would cost Jonah his excuses. But refusing to act felt like letting someone else write my life's obligations into a ledger I had never signed. So I started to collect evidence. I recorded conversations in my pocket when Mark got careless and proud. I printed out bank statements when I could access them. I made lists of names and dates and leaned on Mara for legal counsel. I told Hannah, my old roommate, because keeping this secret felt like carrying glass in my mouth. She offered me a bed for a night, or forever if I needed it, and brewed me coffee strong enough to stop my hands from trembling. We are creatures of story, I thought, each telling a version of ourselves that we want to be true. I was repaying a debt not by cleaning a garage or by folding laundry, but by returning an account to honesty. That was my kind of payment. Not the kind Mark demanded, but the kind that unhooked me from his ledger and let me stand without owing anyone my silence. The decision to act felt like stepping into cold water. Once you break the surface, there's no pretending you never got wet. I remember the night I walked into the county attorney's office with a manila folder that had my entire life in it. The fluorescent lights hummed as if to a distant radio, and the receptionist gave me a sympathetic look that made me both grateful and defensive. Filing a formal complaint felt like signing my own indictment. "Why now?" the assistant district attorney asked, a woman named Liza with a voice that suited courtroom battles. Her palms were flat on the table. "You could have done this years ago." "Because I didn't know," I said, which was true in part. "Because I didn't want to hurt Claire. Because I was afraid of what truth would do to everyone." Liza nodded like she'd heard this kind of grief before. "We'll investigate," she said. "But you have to understand, this could lead to criminal charges." Criminal. The word landed like a stone. I thought of Mark's hands, of his steady smile at city council meetings, of the way Claire's shoulders trembled when he scolded her. I thought about Jonah, drinking in his room. I thought about the kids I met at the clinic who had no one to call. I had always wanted to be on the side of accountability. Now it felt like standing on a cliff and deciding to swing the rope. We began with small legal steps, filing FOIA requests, subpoenaing bank records, and interviewing agency staff who still remembered the case. It was meticulous, ordinary work, phone calls under bad fluorescent lights, emails sent with attachments, transcripts that needed verifying. But there were moments that felt cinematic. The first time we found a check made payable to agency fee that matched dates on the file. The time an elderly social worker said, with a shaky voice, "There were deals then we didn't like." Each new entry in the folder reframed the narrative of my life. Each revelation told me that public virtue and private transactions had been braided together in a way I could no longer ignore. I hadn't anticipated the personal costs. When Jonah found out I had taken the case public, When a mild piece in the neighborhood paper mentioned an investigation into irregular adoption practices, and his face registered horror, he disappeared for days. He left me voicemails that were alternately pleading and furious. "You're not thinking about Claire," he said. "You're not thinking about me." He accused me of betrayal in lines that echoed Mark's original sentence. "You owe us." "What do I owe you?" I asked him once, breathless on the phone. The line buzzed. "What is it you want me to pay with?" "My life. My truth." He didn't have an answer. He only had anger, and anger is a currency that pays in guilt. The first time Mark looked me in the eye and said, "We saved you," after I filed the complaint, it was a threat and an entreaty. He had changed his tactics. Instead of the casual pronouncement of years past, he tried on a new cloak, pity. "Look at what you're doing," he said, in a voice that tried to mix fatherliness with exasperation. "Do you want people to think badly of us? Of Claire?" He positioned himself as the injured party. I felt my body tilt with old habit. My shoulders lowered, my tone softened. "I want people to know the truth," I said. "Not your version. Not your tidy accounting." That uglified the house into something narrower. The small rituals, the way Claire had always set mugs in a certain place, the hum of the dishwasher, acquired a razor edge. Neighbors started to pick sides quietly, the kind of subtle gossip that feels like wind stripping leaves from a tree. Some of Mark's friends stopped returning his calls. Claire, in the in-between spaces of her medical appointments, looked bewildered and then angry. She never fully understood the ledger as I did, but she knew when the house had turned into something other than a shelter, it had become a courtroom. If you're still with me, and if this resonates, has something similar ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. There's comfort in not being alone. Court dates were set. The DA's office moved with bureaucratic precision, arrest warrants drafted in legal language that sounded like a cold wall. Mark was charged with fraud and coercion, multiple counts involving misrepresentation of adoption funds and exploiting vulnerable women who had relinquished children under pressure. The charges were narrower than I hoped. The law moves cautiously where moral clarity could be broad. The arrest happened on a rain-slick Tuesday. I sat in my car across the street from the house and watched officers in navy uniforms move in. Mark stepped out onto his porch in a robe, hair wild, and for a moment he looked tiny against the broad green lawn. He tried to stand tall, his face a practiced blank, but when they read him his rights he looked at me and mouthed, "We saved you." It was a small, private thing, as if he needed me to witness him, to claim some righteousness in finality. Seeing him led in cuffs was a complicated relief. The public spectacle was ugly. Cameras flashed, neighbors peered through curtains, and Jonah stood on the sidewalk with his hands shoved into his jacket. Claire sat on the front steps, wrapped in a blanket, and watched as if the scene were a movie she couldn't pause. There was something almost pagan in the way the community gathered, pebbles in the creek of our lives, eyes flicking, values evaluated. Legal battles followed, depositions, hearings, and a trial that lasted 3 months. I testified. Sitting in a windowless room under artificial light, I recounted details I had carried like stones. I watched Mark watch me. He did not yell. He did not beg. He looked like a man watching a verdict he'd rehearsed. Jonah did not attend the trial. He could not bear to watch what he had chosen to ignore crystallize into evidence. Instead he got angry in other ways, picking fights with friends, sleeping in his car. There were nights after testifying when my hands shook until dawn. I would pace my small apartment, stopping by the window to watch the bakery lights come on. The air would smell like night rain and bread. I had made a moral choice and it had consequences not only for Mark but for Claire and Jonah, but also for me. My name was now in court transcripts and news articles and the public ledger that replaces privacy. I had repaid what Mark insisted I owed in a currency he had never intended, truth-telling, born against his will. The final verdict was a mixture of justice and the limits of law. Mark was convicted on several counts and given a sentence that would keep him away for a number of years. The judge's words were formal, but there was an undertone of recognition for the harm done. People outside clapped in muted ways. Jonah did not clap. He sat in the back with his head bowed. After the sentence, Mark wrote me a letter from prison. It was his attempt at final accounting. "We saved you," he wrote, "and you turned on us." There was anger, but there was also a plea: pay us back. I kept the letter for a long time before I burned it in a shallow pan on my stove, watching the edges curl while the house filled with the smell of smoke and old paper. The act felt ceremonial. The smell of burnt ink felt like a kind of absolution. Conviction did not resolve the quiet wars at home. Prison couldn't mend Claire's nights or Jonah's wounds. In some ways, it complicated everything. Mark was physically removed, but the web he had spun remained. People on our block still glanced at me sideways. The Whiteman house had become a marker. Claire's recovery was slow and patchy. She needed help with daily things that used to be invisible: managing medication, paying bills, getting to appointments. Jonah, for his part, oscillated between fierce independence and sudden, soft apologies. He would show up with bags of groceries sometimes, slump on the couch, and then leave again. Guilt has a selfish rhythm. The community support we received was ambivalent. Some people offered casseroles and cheerful casseroles, while others whispered in doorways. There was a group from church that insisted on praying for us, and they brought lemon bars. Their visits felt like an exhalation, a stammered attempt at healing. The non-profit where I worked offered counseling services, which I used reluctantly. I am nothing if not a listener, but asking for support felt like admitting that my ledger needed balance not with money, but with care. One of the hardest parts was dealing with the practical fallout. Investigation revealed financial misappropriations that affected the house. Our savings had been funneled into ventures Mark hid. Claire was left with fewer resources than either of us expected. We had legal battles over the house and assets, and attorneys, cold, efficient, discussed selling the home I'd once slept in as a child. The possibility of losing the house felt like losing another kind of shelter. I found myself in countless meetings about budgets and power of attorney, learning new words like emergency guardianship and estate liquidation. The emotional toll of clerical procedures is underrated. There is a slow erosion that happens when the mechanics of survival become a spreadsheet. I chose, in the end, to step into the responsibility of care. Maybe it was penance, the old ledger whispering that I owed them something, but it was more than that. It felt like ownership of my life in the truest sense, choosing to act, not because someone had saved me, but because adults take responsibility for one another. I moved Claire into my small apartment for a season, learning how to navigate her medicine schedule, the way her hands would tremble when she tried to button a sleeve. We installed a small ramp at my building entrance, and my landlord was kind enough to allow modifications. There were trips to physical therapy and nights where we watched old sitcoms and laughed like people learning a rhythm again. Jonah, after a few failed attempts at sober living and a stint in rehab, moved back into the house for a while. We argued, shouted even, about things small and enormous. He accused me at times of stealing the narrative, of making myself the hero. I listened. He wanted a simple fix, for things to return to how they'd been, even if how they'd been had been bitter. I told him no, that return was not possible. That was probably the single most humane thing I said during those years. You can't go back. As Mark's appeals threaded through the system, he wrote letters, thin, ink-stained appeals that alternated between revenge and supplication. One line he repeated like a prayer or curse was the original sentence that would follow him his whole life. "We saved you." I realized over and over that he was trying to maintain leverage even from behind concrete walls. The moral weight he had imposed could be wielded from a cell. It reminded me of how people hold on to hymns of power to keep others small. When Mark contracted a serious illness in prison, an infection that spread quickly, his health deteriorated in a way that confronted me with an old moral knot. Claire called me one night, voice small. "He's not well," she said. "Do you think you could go?" Her asking felt like an offering and a reopening of an old wound. I had already paid with truth and public testimony. Was it my place now to pay with caregiving? The decision to visit him in the prison infirmary was not simple. I tried to imagine what forgiveness would look like, whether it was necessary, whether it would be for him or for me. I climbed the steps to the visiting room, metal detectors beeping, fluorescent lights humming, and felt like a person in a confessional. The man who sat across from me was smaller, thinner, his hair threadbare. He looked up with surprise and something like recognition. "You did this," he said, pointing with a finger that trembled. The accusation was a taut wire. "I told the truth," I said. The sentence landed. There was no anger in it, just the quietness of an accounting being settled. He tried to pivot. "We saved you," he said, soft as a benediction, and then, with a faint, absurd hope, "So why are you leaving me?" "Because saving someone doesn't buy them a monopoly on my life," I answered. The words I had finally learned to say to him were not explosive. They were factual, adult, clean. He closed his eyes as if he were trying to sleep in the middle of a conversation. "I'm not here to punish you," I added. "I'm here to say goodbye." When I left the prison, there was a rain that made the world smell like new leaves, the season changing like a small miracle. I walked to my car with the rain soaking through my jacket and felt, for the first time in years, a clarity that was both terrifying and relieving. I had repaid a debt not by giving myself away, but by reclaiming my own account. The repayment was not in money or in obedience. It was in truth, in boundaries, in the hard work of caregiving without losing myself. It was messy. It was costly. It was real. There were nights after that where the whole world felt too loud and I would put my head down on the kitchen table and weep. Not for Mark, not even for Claire, but for the idea that we are all broken and messy and trying. The lesson I took from those nights was not a tidy aphorism but a slow, gritty sense that living honestly sometimes inflicts collateral damage, and sometimes that damage is the price of dignity. Time has a flattening effect on drama. Years stack up and the edges of scandal file down. But the memory of the ledger, the sentence, "We saved you. You owe us," remains sharp in me like a carved word. I teach the people I case manage to write their own lists now, not of what they owe to others but of what they owe to themselves. There's a chapter in every life where the narrative someone else wrote for you must be read again, questioned, and, when necessary, edited out. After the trial and the shaky, slow healing, I made choices that felt like payments in a currency I believed in: honesty, care, and personal autonomy. I stayed in Portland and continued my work with the non-profit, helping others navigate the same kinds of claims of ownership I had once been entangled in. I visited Claire as often as I could. We learned to cook together. Simple things like tomato soup and grilled cheese. And in the quiet afternoons, she would tell me small stories about her childhood that had nothing to do with Mark. It felt like reclaiming a person forgotten inside a role. Jonah and I mended in fits and starts. He got a steady job at a warehouse and slowly learned how to keep appointments and let anger cool before speaking. We sat on porches and talked about cheap things, sports, weather, the ridiculousness of our high school reunion, and those small conversational threads rewove a different kind of family fabric. He no longer used the phrase, "We saved you," as armor. Sometimes he apologized for not acting sooner, but mainly we moved forward with the practical business of being siblings. There were unexpected gifts in the aftermath. One of Mark's former colleagues, an older man named Harvey who had been coy at the trial, reached out months after the sentencing with an envelope of letters, apologies, confessions, a few documents that corroborated the darker corners of the ledger. He said he'd been too frightened to come forward before, fear being another kind of ledger. His small act of contrition wasn't a cure-all, but it helped fill in blanks and brought a measure of public clarity. I repaid my debt not through violence, not through silence, but through something harder: the willingness to choose the truth even though it hurt people I loved. The repayment was legal testimony, yes, but also the daily care of services and visits, the time in doctors' offices, and the nights of holding Claire's hand while she slept. Repayment, in my hands, became a verb that described staying present without being owned. There is a line that people often ask me about: do I regret it? Do I wish I'd done things differently? For a long time I told myself the answer was complicated. It still is. I regret some moments, the nights I didn't leave sooner, the times I pretended ignorance when I could have asked more questions, but regret is not the opposite of growth. If anything, my regret is a map of the places I learned to be braver. If you've been following this and want to hear more about cases like mine, don't forget to subscribe. It helps bring these conversations into rooms where people need them. The last time I stood on the porch of the Whiteman house, the new owners were painting the trim a color I didn't like. The house looked smaller and more ordinary, and for a brief second it did not belong to my story at all. I watched the paintbrush stroke and felt something settle, not with triumph but with a quiet, steady finality. The debt had been repaid in the way that mattered, not with servitude but with honesty, care, and the hard work of rebuilding. If there's a lesson I've learned to pass on, it's this. Debt spoken as moral obligations can be a kind of bondage. When someone tells you they saved you, be wary of the price they name. You are not currency. You are not collateral. Repaying a debt that someone else places on you is not always to give them what they demand. Sometimes repayment is telling the truth, protecting the vulnerable, and choosing your own worth. I still think of Mark sometimes, his letters, his last week attempts at holding power. But those thoughts come and go like weather, and I have learned to measure myself by my choices, not by his ledger. The family I have now is chosen and complicated, stitched together not by guilt but by effort. I am still paying in the best sense, by being present, by setting boundaries, and by helping others file their own records straight. Thank you for listening to this. If something in this story landed for you, a like, a share, or a comment helps other people find it. If you're carrying a debt someone told you you owed, you are not alone. There are people and systems that can help you untangle it. I read every message, and sometimes I reply. There is no clean closure here, only the slow, stubborn work of living honestly.